In the summer of 1940, one of the most dangerous military minds in Britain was standing at a road checkpoint in Warwickshire, asking motorists where they were going. His name was Percy Hobart. He was 54 years old. He wore a Home Guard armband because that was the only uniform the British Army would give him. 3 months earlier, he had commanded a division in Egypt. Now he was asking a farmer in a Ford whether he had any business being on this road after dark. This was not a demotion. A demotion implies you are still in the system. Hobart had been removed from the system entirely. Retired. Finished. Declared surplus to requirements by an institution that he had spent 30 years trying to drag into the 20th century, and which had finally decided it preferred to stay where it was. What makes this not just sad but genuinely insane is what Hobart actually knew. By 1934, he had built and commanded the first British armoured brigade ever assembled. Not just commanded it on paper, personally designed the tactics, ran the exercises, pushed the machines and the men until he understood exactly what tanks could do when they stopped being used as expensive substitutes for cavalry and started being used as something entirely new. He had coordinated armour with aircraft and infantry in ways the training manuals did not describe, because the training manuals had been written by men who had never been inside a tank and did not intend to start. His exercises were watched by military observers from across Europe. The Germans took notes. The British took offence. The problem was not that Hobart was wrong. The problem was that he was right in a way that made the men above him look like they had wasted a decade. A general who makes other generals feel stupid does not last long. It does not matter how correct he is. It matters how comfortable the people above him are, and Hobart made nobody comfortable. He said what he thought directly, without the diplomatic softening that institutions require to function smoothly, and what he thought was frequently that the people outranking him had no idea what they were doing. He was right. That made everything worse. By 1939, he was in Egypt, building the mobile division that would become the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. He was doing it by ignoring roughly half the directives from Cairo headquarters, which he considered operationally illiterate. Cairo headquarters considered him uncontrollable. In 1940, General Wavell had him removed and sent home. The retirement papers described him as difficult, unable to work within established structures. Hobart signed them and joined the Home Guard. Here is what the Home Guard was in the summer of 1940. It was not an army. It was several 100,000 men, most of them over 50 or under 18, equipped with whatever could be found in garden sheds and church halls. Some units had rifles, some had shotguns, some had pikes, actual pikes, manufactured and distributed by the War Office, because there was genuinely nothing else available. Their stated purpose was to slow a German invasion long enough for the real army to respond. Nobody who had looked honestly at the numbers believed they could do even that. Corporal Percy Hobart stood at his checkpoint in Warwickshire and did not complain. His colleagues said he was punctual, methodical. He never mentioned Egypt. He never mentioned the 7th Armoured Division. He checked identification cards and noted registration plates and did the job that was in front of him. Because what else do you do when you are a man built for war and the war has decided it does not need you? Then a letter arrived on Winston Churchill's desk. It was written by Basil Liddell Hart, a military historian who had spent 20 years studying armoured warfare and had watched the British military sideline every officer who understood it. Liddell Hart had a habit of writing letters to powerful people when he saw something that offended his sense of logic. The letter to Churchill was 4 paragraphs. The essential content was this: the man who designed British armoured doctrine and personally trained the formation now fighting Rommel in the desert is standing at a road junction in Warwickshire in a Home Guard armband. This is not a figure of speech. This is literally happening right now. Churchill read it on a Tuesday. He was at that point managing the Battle of Britain, the political fallout from Dunkirk, the threat of invasion, and the daily reality of being the man who had warned about all of this for a decade, while the same institution, now asking him to lead it, had spent those years ensuring he had no power to act. He was not a man with patience for institutional stupidity, particularly not when it was wasting something he needed. He summoned his military secretary. He asked why Hobart had been retired. The military secretary returned with the official answer: difficult personality, unable to work within established structures. Churchill looked at this for a moment. Then he wrote back that he did not want generals who could make everybody comfortable. He wrote that he wanted generals who could win. He ordered Hobart returned to active service immediately. The War Office received this instruction and did what large institutions do when they are forced to obey an order they resent. They obeyed it in the narrowest possible way. They could not refuse Churchill, but they could control the situation. They gave Hobart a command so hollow it was almost an insult, dressed as a promotion. The 79th Armoured Division. On paper, it was a full division. In reality, it was a collection of equipment that every other formation in the British Army had already rejected. Tanks that had failed their mechanical trials, experimental vehicles that testing committees had declared impractical. Old machinery with problems nobody had bothered to solve because it was easier to write it off and requisition something new. The officers assigned were the ones their previous commands had been trying to get rid of. The enlisted men had disciplinary records or skills that the army had classified as irrelevant. It was a pile of broken things and difficult people, given to a man the War Office had just been forced to reinstate and still hoped would quietly fail. Hobart drove to the 79th's headquarters on a grey February morning in 1942. His adjutant, a captain named Reynolds, met him at the gate. Reynolds had prepared a summary of the division's deficiencies. It ran to 4 pages. He had also prepared privately for the response he expected: demands to the War Office for proper equipment, complaints, threats to resign. Hobart took the inventory list. He read it without speaking. He read it the way a surgeon reads a patient's chart before an operation, looking for what is actually there, not what should be there. He set it down. He said, "We will start on Monday." Reynolds waited. Nothing else came. He asked what, specifically, they would be starting. Hobart said he would explain on Monday. Then he asked Reynolds for something that Reynolds did not expect. Not a staff list or a logistics report or a maintenance schedule. He asked for detailed maps of the Normandy coastline, every beach, every gradient, every obstacle the Germans had put in the water and on the sand. Reynolds asked how Hobart knew the landing would be in Normandy. That information was classified above his clearance level, above most people's clearance levels. Hobart looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has spent 30 years thinking about how armies fight and has simply worked it out. He said, "Where else would it be?" He picked up the first map and did not look up again for 2 hours. Reynolds stood in the doorway of the office and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever the War Office thought it had done by giving Hobart this division, it had not made him go away. It had given him exactly what he needed to build something they had never imagined. On the morning of November 3rd, 1942, a Valentine tank drove into a lake in southern England and sank in 40 seconds. The crew got out. The tank did not. It settled on the bottom in 12 feet of water, while Percy Hobart stood on the bank and watched without moving. His engineers stood beside him. Nobody spoke. The canvas flotation screen that was supposed to keep 30 tons of steel on the surface had collapsed on the starboard side, approximately 8 seconds after the tank entered the water, and the rest had followed the mathematics. Hobart stood there for a long moment. Then he turned to his chief engineer, Major Sykes, and said, "Find out why the starboard side collapsed and fix it." We try again on Thursday. Sykes asked what they should do differently on Thursday. Hobart said, "Get the starboard side right." He walked back to his office. He did not raise his voice. He did not file a report to the War Office explaining that the project had encountered difficulties. He sat down at his desk and continued working on the next problem. Because there were 6 problems, and this was only the first one, and falling apart over a sunken tank in a lake in November was a luxury that the men who would eventually drive these machines onto a beach in France could not afford. This is the part of the story that the official histories skip. They describe the finished weapons, the ingenious solutions. They do not describe the 18 months before the finished weapons existed, when the 79th Armoured Division was a collection of broken equipment and difficult men trying to build things that had never been built before, failing regularly and continuing anyway. The central problem Hobart had fixed in his mind from the first week was this. A beach assault fails at the waterline, not at the bunkers, not at the seawall. At the exact moment when men step out of landing craft into shallow water and begin crossing open sand with no cover and no armour, because the tanks that were supposed to support them either have not arrived yet or have been destroyed by obstacles before they reach the shore. Every major amphibious assault in the war so far had confirmed this. The first minutes on the beach were when you died. Everything after that was recoverable if you survived the first minutes. The solution was a tank that did not need a landing craft to bring it to shore. A tank that launched from a ship 2 miles out, crossed the water under its own power, and arrived on the beach, ready to fire, before the infantry stepped out of their boats. The Valentine that sank in November was the first prototype. The canvas flotation screen was the correct concept. The engineering was not yet correct. Sykes and his team spent 11 days on the problem. They rebuilt the screen frame, changed the attachment points, added a bilge pump, and on November 14th, they put a second Valentine into the same lake. It crossed to the far bank in 6 minutes and drove out onto the grass and sat there, dripping and functional, while the crew climbed out and Hobart's engineers looked at each other with the specific expression of people who have just proved that something impossible is merely very difficult. Hobart walked around the tank once. He looked at the screen. He looked at the tracks. He said, "Now do it in a chop. I want to know what sea state kills it." They spent 3 more months finding the answer to that question. The answer was uncomfortable. In anything above moderate seas, the screen was not reliable. The tank was survivable in calm water and dangerous in rough water and fatal in anything resembling bad conditions. Hobart wrote this down precisely as it was and did not soften it. His report to the War Office noted the sea state limitation clearly and recommended that DD tanks be launched no more than 1 mile from shore and only in conditions below a specified wave height. He wrote this because he understood that the men driving these tanks onto a beach would be relying on whoever made the launch decision to have read his report and followed it. He had no way to guarantee that they would. He continued anyway, because the alternative was infantry crossing that beach without armour, and he had done the arithmetic on what that looked like. The second problem was the mines. The beach surface between the waterline and the fortifications was seeded with pressure mines that a man's weight could trigger, and a tank's weight would certainly trigger. Standard procedure was to send engineers forward on foot to clear lanes manually. Manual mine clearance under fire, across a beach, with machine guns covering every metre of ground, was not a tactic. It was an instruction to die slowly in a specific location. Hobart's solution was already sitting in a maintenance shed. A prototype mine flail, a rotating drum with heavy chains that beat the ground ahead of the tank and detonated mines before the tracks reached them, had been submitted to an evaluation committee in 1941 and rejected. The rejection report was 3 pages. Hobart read all 3 pages carefully, looking for the actual reason. The actual reason was on page 2. The chains wore out after 200 meters and required replacement. The The committee had written this up as a fatal operational limitation. Hobart sat with this for a moment. Then he wrote in the margin, 200 meters is the width of a beach. Replace the chains before the operation, not during it. He approved the crab for development the same afternoon. Behind the mines were the bunkers, concrete fortifications set into the dunes with firing apertures covering every approach. A standard tank shell hitting a bunker wall transferred its energy to the concrete and stopped. The crew inside kept firing. The infantry following the tanks was pinned in the open by a weapon that direct fire could not silence. The petard was a Churchill tank with a spigot mortar that fired a 40-pound demolition charge at close range. It did not need to penetrate the wall. It needed to put a charge through the aperture or blow a section of wall apart at a range where a tank crew would normally consider themselves suicidally close to an active fortification. Hobart tested it himself, riding in the vehicle during a live trial against a concrete wall replica. His engineers had suggested he observe from a safer distance. He said he needed to understand what the crew experienced. The charge went through the aperture at 140 meters, and the mock fortification ceased to exist. Hobart noted the gun smoke obscured the crew's vision for approximately 4 seconds after firing and asked for the ventilation system to be improved. By the spring of 1943, the 79th had working prototypes of 5 specialist vehicles, DD tanks that floated, crabs that cleared mines, petards that demolished bunkers, bridge layers that could put a crossing over a seawall in under 30 seconds, crocodiles, Churchill tanks with flamethrowers that projected burning fuel 120 meters into fortifications the petard could not reach. In May 1943, General Omar Bradley came to watch a demonstration. Hobart ran it without commentary. The DD tanks crossed the test lake. The crabs flailed a minefield clean. The petard put a charge through a mock bunker aperture. The bridge layer deployed against a concrete wall in 27 seconds. Bradley watched all of it and asked precise, intelligent questions that showed he understood exactly what he had seen. Then he sat down with Hobart and declined. His staff's assessment was that the vehicles were mechanically complex. American forces would rely on air power and naval gunfire to suppress beach defenses before landing. Standard armor and infantry would handle the rest. Hobart looked at Bradley across the table. He did not argue. He had spent 30 years arguing with men who had already made up their minds, and he knew exactly what it accomplished. He thanked Bradley for his time. He showed him out. He went back to his office. He opened his journal and wrote one sentence. He wrote, "They have decided to solve the problem by sending more men." He closed the journal. He had 11 months before the landings. He used all of them to make sure that the men going onto the British beaches would not need to rely on the same decision. He could not do anything about the American beaches. That fact sat in the back of everything he did for the next 11 months. Unspoken, unresolvable, present every morning when he arrived at his desk and every evening when he left it. He built the machines anyway. For the beaches he could reach. For the men he could still save. 27 tanks sank before they reached Omaha Beach. The crews went into the water at 6:30 in the morning in a June sea that was cold enough to kill a man in 20 minutes. Most of them did not have 20 minutes. The canvas screens that were supposed to keep 30 tons of steel afloat collapsed in the waves exactly the way Percy Hobart's report had said they would collapse if the launch distance was not adjusted for sea conditions. The report had been written 18 months earlier. It had specified the maximum safe distance precisely. The officer who gave the launch order at Omaha had read it, or had access to it, and launched at 6,000 yards anyway. Of 32 DD tanks assigned to Omaha, 5 reached the beach. The infantry that followed them came off the ramps into open sand, facing undamaged fortifications on high ground, with fields of fire covering every meter of beach below. There was no armor ahead of them. There was no path through the mines. There was nothing between them and the guns except distance, and they had to close that distance on foot. But first, 60 miles to the east, it is 6:25 in the morning on Gold Beach, and the ramps are dropping, and Hobart's machines are going to work. The DD tanks went first. They had launched 800 meters from shore, within the limit Hobart had written into his report, in conditions that were rough but survivable for a well-built screen. When the tracks touched sand, the screens dropped and the tanks were already firing, already moving up the beach before the first infantry boot hit the waterline. The Germans in the bunkers above Gold Beach had built their defensive plan around a window of several minutes. Men on foot crossing open sand while the fortifications engaged them freely. That window did not open. The armor was already there, already closing the distance, and the defensive guns were traversing to targets they had not expected to be dealing with yet. Behind the DD tanks came the crabs, slow and loud and completely methodical, chains beating the sand, mines detonating in small eruptions of dirt beneath the flails, cleared lanes appearing behind them that the infantry used without slowing down. Behind the crabs came the petards, a German 88mm gun emplacement at the eastern end of Gold Beach, had survived the naval bombardment and was firing along the waterline. In 90 seconds, it killed 11 men. A petard closed to 160 meters and put a demolition charge through the aperture. The crew inside had no warning. The charge arrived before the sound of the shot. The gun stopped firing and did not start again. By 7:30, 1 hour after the first wave landed, British infantry was off Gold Beach and moving inland. The 50th Infantry Division lost 413 men that morning. Now go back to Omaha. Same morning, same enemy, same Atlantic wall. Same concrete bunkers built into the same kind of dunes, with the same 88mm guns covering the same open sand. Private First Class Cecil Breeden was 19 years old, and he was in the third boat of the first wave. He had been told the bunkers would be destroyed by the time the ramps dropped. He had been told there would be tanks on the beach ahead of him. The boat hit the sandbar, and the ramp went down, and Breeden stepped into chest-deep water and looked at the beach and saw neither of those things. He saw open sand and intact fortifications, and the men ahead of him, going down in the water before they cleared the ramp. He saw the man directly to his left fold and go under, without making a sound. He moved forward, because stopping meant drowning, and the only direction that was not water was forward. He made the beach. He pressed himself flat on the sand and did not move, because moving meant standing up, and standing up meant dying. The shingle bank at the top of the beach was 30 meters away, and 30 meters was an impossible distance on that morning, with the guns covering every centimeter of it. He stayed flat. He stayed flat for 40 minutes while the men around him died, or did not move, or tried to move, and died. By noon, 2,000 American soldiers were dead or wounded on Omaha Beach. Commanders offshore were discussing whether to abandon the landing entirely. They did not abandon it. Small groups of men found drawers in the bluff that the defensive plan had not fully covered and went up them, and the line eventually broke. By nightfall, Omaha was taken. The landing succeeded. June 6th was a victory. But the men who took Omaha took it the way the British military had been taking beaches before Hobart built his machines. They took it by crossing open ground, on foot, under fire, with no armor and no path through the mines, and no way to silence the bunkers, except to reach them and kill the crews by hand. They took it the way you take a position when you have decided that the problem of crossing a defended beach is solved by sending enough men to absorb the losses and keep moving. 413 against 2,000. Same morning, same enemy, same defenses, different decision. Percy Hobart received the Omaha figures 2 days after the landing. He was at his headquarters in England, working through after-action reports from Gold and Juno and Sword, when the American numbers came through on a single sheet of paper. He read the sheet once. He set it face down on his desk. He sat very still for a moment that nobody in the room measured, but everyone in the room noticed. He did not say anything about Bradley. He did not say anything about the May 1943 assessment that had described his machines as too mechanically complex. He did not say anything about the Sea State report, or the launch distance, or the 27 tanks that had gone into the water at 6,000 yards in a sea state that the report had explicitly warned against. He picked the paper up and filed it. He never made the comparison publicly. Not in the weeks after the landing, not in the official assessments, not in the interviews he gave in later years when historians came to ask him what the 79th Armoured Division had accomplished. The numbers were in the record. The record was available to anyone who wanted to look at it. He did not need to explain what 413 against 2,000 meant to a person willing to read two documents side by side. In August 1944, Hobart was knighted. The citation described his contribution to the success of the Normandy landings. It did not mention the Home Guard armband. It did not mention the Valentine tank on the bottom of a lake in November 1942. It did not mention the retirement papers signed in 1940 by a man the British Army had decided it did not need. Percy Hobart died in 1957. His machines are still called Hobart's Funnies. The name came from soldiers who saw them for the first time and did not know what to make of the shapes. Funny-looking things, strange purposes, tanks that floated, tanks with flails, tanks that carried bridges, tanks that breathed fire. On the beaches, where they were used, they changed what was possible in the first 30 minutes. On the beach, where they were not, 2,000 men found out what was possible without them. The American cemetery at Omaha sits on the bluff directly above the beach. On a clear day, you can see the waterline from the grave markers. You can look down at the sand and measure the distance with your eyes. It is not a long distance. That is the part that stays with you. It is not a long distance at all.